We are so incredibly back, no Kiseki, and yet why did this take me several weeks to make a video on? Well, our good friend and esteemed president of Nihon Falcom Corporation, Toshihiro Kondo, did not make it very easy to actually start a video on this. Because every time I tried, he'd say something else that would send me into another rabbit hole that would completely reshape the entire analysis. And now that Kai is going to be out by the time this video is, he's not talking about Sky the First anymore, so I have enough room to breathe and actually make the video. This video will not involve spoilers whatsoever, but as this is a very faithful appearing remake, I am going to be analyzing everything in comparison to the original game, so if you haven't played the original Sky First chapter, you might be very lost. I'm still going to be giving opinions on the game and its existence overall, and whether or not it will be a better starting point for the series than the original Sky, so you will get things out of this. You might just not know what I'm talking about when I compare something to how it was in the original. Before I start analyzing the trailer itself, I'm going to talk about meta things around it, because this is where Falcom has started to confuse and annoy me once again. The first is continued proof that every statement from Falcom about wanting to do better by Western fans is still just kind of PR speak and a blatant lie. Like, yeah, okay, you're closing the localization gap with Daybreak. You made it from 3 years back down to 2 years. That's the exact same gap that Xseed had when they were doing Cold Steel 1 and 2, so we have made a complete lateral move now. Anyway, the announcement of this game in the Western version of the Direct was part of a sizzle reel. It was the first thing in the sizzle reel. It was the most exciting thing in the sizzle reel. But it was 15 seconds in a sizzle reel, and then one tweet from official Nintendo regional accounts. And while this post does show off incredible artwork that should get anyone excited for this kind of JRPG if that's your jam, it doesn't show any of the trailer footage. It does not show screenshots, despite some journalists being provided English versions of screenshots that were provided in Japanese on the official site as well, and a logo they had to actively try to screw up as far as I can tell. This is the Japanese logo for Trails in the Sky the First. You'll notice it does not say the first anywhere with it. This is the same logo that was used for the original release of Sky First Chapter back 20 years ago. So that's alright, but there is a full English logo for Sky First Chapter that exists already. I am looking at it directly on Steam. Falcom appears to be using the same translation from that version. Why would they not also have rights to the logo? But yeah, instead of actually translating the kanji that say Sora no Kiseki, they just took the kanji that say Eiu Densetsu and replaced it with English The Legend of Heroes, which actually tracks for even the Japanese logos of every Trails game after the Sky arc, so that actually makes it more consistent with the rest of the series than anything. But they also took the katakana writing of Sora no Kiseki underneath the kanji and wrote Trails in the Sky in English in a very basic font underneath that. And like, that's actually somewhat fair and reasonable for a company that's always used external licensors and publishers to localize their games for a tentative logo when they're clearly still working on Sky, as well as the new Tokyo Xanadu that's coming out in 2025 as well. They're probably not deep into work on Sky the First, so this is okay as a tentative logo. They didn't even bother using the same version they used for the Japanese logo as a basis. The orbment behind the kanji for Sora no Kiseki still says The Legend of Heroes 6 Second Chapter on it, despite ostensibly being a logo for a remake of First Chapter, while the Japanese logo only says The Legend of Heroes. Truly showing the amount of will and effort they're going to put in to make sure Western fans get the exact same experience as Japanese ones, which is exactly why Chinese and Korean localizations for Kai are coming out the same day the Japanese game is, and why they only paid for a quarter the trailer length with no narration for the Western trailer, and then also dropped a Japan exclusive 2-minute cut of the same trailer a couple days later after the Direct. Forgive me for preemptively not believing you the next time you say you want the series to be caught up around the world. Anyway, since there's no point in actually analyzing the Western Direct sizzle reel segment, since it's all stuff from the longer Japanese trailer, let's just focus on one thing at the end, and that is that the game is stated to be published by Falcom, which is weird because Falcom never publishes their own games outside of literally Japan. A lot of people were confused by this when the announcement first came out, including Sal Romano of Gamatsu, who reached out to NIS America, who's been handling Western localization and publishing for Trails for the last 7 years. They said that NIS is not the distributor, and in a later update, a Falcom rep released more comments on this to Gematsu. The first one is actually about what platforms the game will be on, but I'm going to talk about the Western publisher one first. The rep said, "At this time, the Western publisher is to be determined, which is why our company name, that being Falcom, was mentioned in the announcement. There's a possibility that we may handle distribution ourselves, but if arrangements are made with a local publisher, they would be responsible for distribution instead." You heard that right. They are saying that they announced a game will have a worldwide release without knowing who the publisher for most of the world is going to be. And the other thing that makes it impossible to guess is, even if they don't publish it themselves, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be NISA that's publishing the Western version, because as of next year, in a 12-month period, there will have been 3 different publishers handling Falcom games. Just in July of 2024, there was Trails Through Daybreak, which was NISA. Then later in the month, the Switch version of Tokyo Xanadu EX Plus, which did have a new English localization and additional content, which was localized and published by Axis Games. And then in 2025, before Sky First, is Ys Memoir Oath in Falgana, a remaster of a remake of the original Ys 3 for PS4, PS5, and Switch, that is being published by Xseed Games from Marvelous USA, and while it is reusing the script from the original Xseed version of Oath in Falgana, does contain new dialogue for Adol, as well as new voice acting for that new dialogue, which means brand new localizations of Falcom games will have been done by 3 different companies, and Falcom could be partnering with any of them, none of them, or some other 4th publisher, and not even Falcom knows what they're doing yet. This game comes out in less than 15 months. While Xseed is definitely the most likely of the 3 publishers doing stuff this year, that doesn't mean it's going to be them or nobody. And that's because Falcom does appear to completely own Xseed's localized scripts for their games, as Xseed did the original English localization of Ys Origin, and when that game got a new port, Western publishing was actually handled by .emu, but while .emu did their own French, Italian, German, and Spanish localizations, they did reuse Xseed's English script, as that version of the game did not contain any new dialogue. So yeah, it could be .emu as well, but I don't really think so. The name outside of Xseed that I think is most likely, and this is actually kind of unfortunate, is Nintendo. And that's because of what the Falcom rep told Gematsu about the platforms. While the game has been announced for Nintendo Switch, a release on PlayStation and PC platforms is currently to be determined. There is a possibility it could be released on these platforms, and if that decision is made, it will be announced in a press release at a later date. Hey, Falcom, I thought the entire reason you were so intent on remaking the Sky games was so the first arc of the Trails series would have a more modernized and accessible iteration available to more players. Why did you ever consider releasing it as a Switch exclusive long enough to actually tell journalists about? Every game since Crossbell is on PC, Switch, and PlayStation. Putting this game on anything less than all of those is defeating the purpose of making the game in the first place. This legitimately isn't even a Japanese favoritism thing either this time. The only current platform the Sky games are on, even in Japanese, is PC. So now I have to ask, why are you bothering remaking Sky First Chapter in its entirety for Switch, when you could have done the much easier job of just porting the Evolution versions of the entire trilogy, or even just the original game, honestly, to Switch, PlayStation, and PC again? That version is completely voiced in Japanese, by the way. I'm happy one exists, but to be brutally honest, we don't need a remake of Trails in the Sky. Now, currently, in 2024, before the remake releases, the only excuse to not start the series at Sky First Chapter is not having a PC. All they needed to do was put the existing Sky Trilogy versions in some form on current PlayStation and Nintendo hardware. The idea that Sky is too outdated and old looking for anyone to be interested in is just patently absurd with all the quirky Earthbound inspired indie RPGs that exist. And Cold Steel 1, second best starting point in the entire series. Absolutely start here if you have a PlayStation but no PC or Switch. It doesn't look as good as the Sky trilogy now. Its visuals have aged so much worse. It is a Vita game that you're going to be playing on a full HD home console or PC nowadays. Of course it's not going to look as good as the timeless sprite-based game from 2004. What are people thinking when they say that Sky's visuals turn people away? And I don't think people realize this, but if someone starts with Sky and goes through the entire series in order, before they get to this allegedly better looking Cold Steel 1, you still have the Crossbell games. The ones that use the same visual style as the Sky games. Even after all the Sky games are remade, you will still have to play 2 games in this allegedly horrible, outdated, turns people off constantly style just to get to the modernized, better looking Cold Steel games from handhelds in 2013. If later versions of Cold Steel 1 and 2 were redone in the CS3-4 visual style, I would 100% agree with this criticism, because after Cold Steel 3, when Falcom started primarily developing for consoles and not handhelds, they started looking fantastic for the budget they have and have just been getting better, but not the Vita games. And hey, know what else is up? They're only remaking Sky First Chapter to begin with. This isn't the entire arc coming out at once, it's just the first game. So if someone manages to make it all the way through Sky First Chapter in the remake, and if this is anything like the original, making it all the way through Sky First Chapter is going to be enough to hook someone on the entire series, if they're as impatient as most people who finish FC are, they're going to want to pick up the original version of SC to see the rest of the story anyway, with the old visual style. That is, assuming they have a PC and aren't SOL, and aren't even more SOL if Falcom decides they don't actually want to remake the entire trilogy. Because that's a possibility too, apparently. I am not lying here. In a later stream that was primarily focused on Kai no Kiseki, Kondo revealed some information about Sky First. And the thing that has everyone concerned is the fact that he said they will only be remaking the second and third games if Sky the First sells well. Trails games have been in a bit of a sales slump since the Cold Steel arc ended. This new Trails game is a remake of what is widely known to be a partial story, and will only be on one, albeit the most popular in Japan, platform. I wonder how well this is going to sell. This is worrying, but even the Noisy Pixel article that first reported on this seems that it is corporate speak, so not to pay too much attention to it. And other things Kondo said in this stream raise more questions that very heavily suggest they're planning on remaking all the games regardless. Also, if you remember a video I made earlier this year, Falcom said that they had 10 projects in the works. 3 of them they outright said were remakes of some sort. Even back then, everyone was saying that they're obviously Sky remakes. Even if they're not going to start work on second chapter until they see if the first sells well, they're probably doing pre-production already. And do keep in mind, remaking the other 2 games after the first has already been made is going to cost a lot less than just making the first as a whole, because of the amount of assets they'll be able to reuse. And unironically, from what I've seen of Kai so far, and just from having played the first 2 Daybreak games, even though there are a lot more new areas in Sky the Third compared to second chapter versus first chapter, they could probably reuse assets from Daybreak 2 and Kai for some of those as well, without having to make a lot of things from scratch. So, realistically, the first doesn't need to sell that well for them to be willing to go forward with remaking the others. In other news that makes this a bit more obvious, Kondo also said that Sky the First will feature new details that debuted in later entries of the series post-Sky, which will help cohesion and world building. No specific examples were given, but for people who are caught up on the series, you know exactly what they're talking about. There are a lot of small things that could be tweaked to make the world feel more alive and properly set up things in later games even better than they already have been. The amount of stuff you could cram into the Sky games is on an entirely different scale to putting Toa and Yuna into the PS4 version of Azure. That being said, for people in the know, how much of this dialogue that can be expanded on or have a new CG added or whatever is actually in Sky First Chapter? Outside of literal minor NPC dialogue, off the top of my head, I can't think of any major important changes that it would make sense for them to do that don't come from second chapter at the earliest. So if they're planning on tweaking Sky to add all these references and call forwards and stuff, they're gonna have to remake all of Sky purely because first chapter is so small and self-contained. I think that's a big positive point about it and why it is such a good entry point into the series, but it also doesn't give them a lot of things to expand on, so that comment heavily suggests they already know what they're planning on expanding on in the later games as well. As for the topic of voice acting, as I mentioned before, the Evo versions of the Sky games do have complete Japanese voice acting. Kondo danced around what they would be doing for VA when it came to the first. It seems like a real shame to be throwing out all this voice acting that already exists, but was the quality of the recording itself good enough? I'm not actually sure. And if the things they changed to make the call forwards include main story dialogue that was voiced, would they re-record only those lines? Or would they have the voice acting just not match the dialogue on screen for that little bit? Again, the Crossbell games in their official Western releases are not dubbed at all, because they already have complete Japanese voice acting that is just so comprehensive they couldn't afford to actually dub that, as far as I can tell. Which means that if they do use the Evo voices, then there's no way there's going to be a dub at all, regardless of who's doing the publishing of this. But if Falcom is the one doing the publishing, how would they get a dub made in the first place? And if someone else is doing the publishing, how much of the voice acting is going to exist in Japanese anyway? There is a dub for the existing Sky games, but it's just for battle dialogue, which is the only amount that was voice acted in Japanese in the original release. If the Japanese version has new voice acting for some story scenes to the same degree that, say, a modern Trails game would have, and battle dialogue, would they reuse the battle dialogue and just have the Japanese story dialogue? Would they dub everything? Some characters have had voice actors change in both languages. So what are they going to do with that if some dialogue is old and some dialogue is new? I have no idea what they're doing here, and I really hope it is able to be dubbed, but I don't know if it's worth losing the complete voice acting from the Evo versions for that. So it's a big trade-off, and I think if they're trying to make a new, better entry point and are trying to cater to Western fans better, they should probably have a dub in this game. But if Falcom's publishing it, how are they getting a dub done exactly? To the best of my knowledge, they've never done a localization into any other language that didn't involve a partnership with some external publisher. Maybe, okay, if there's some new dialogue in there or change things, they'd be able to do that much in-house because it's not that much stuff. But an entire dub, I'm not sure how that's going to work. Granted, for the NISA Trails games, I believe the recording studio is contracted out by NISA and not in-house. Some of the translators are even contracted out to NISA and not in-house. So they could use that, but more importantly, hey Falcom, there's a bit of a cheat code here that you haven't realized. PH3, the company that did the PC and Switch ports for a lot of PS4 era Trails games, is not NISA. That is a contractor for NISA. You can hire them yourselves. Please stop letting Clouded Leopard handle the PC ports, even for regions that don't have NISA localizations. The PH3 versions are so much better. Hire them for everything, I am begging you. Oh hey, look at that, almost 20 minutes into the video, and I have not talked about the actual trailer yet. Wow, that's pretty cool. This is a Luxon moment if you've never watched one of my videos before, for sure. Anyway, I've been doing a bit of negativity things, and a lot of very concernedly questioning how Falcom as a company has made it 40 years in the first place, but I'm going to give Kondo a massive benefit of the doubt here, because people took something he said after all the stuff I've talked about so far, and run with it in an incorrect direction. In an interview with the Taiwanese outlet GNN, Kondo stated apparently that he did not know that the game was going to be revealed in that Nintendo Direct. And people were clowning on him with this, but really, this isn't his fault. This isn't anyone at Falcom's fault. Nintendo doesn't tell most third parties when Directs are going to happen, so they didn't know it was going to be revealed then. They obviously had to pay Nintendo for the advertisement spots and give Nintendo the trailers and stuff. They didn't know when that was going to be published, which is what Kondo's saying he was surprised by. He also said something about how this game is 100% being developed in-house by Falcom, because apparently people were questioning if it had been outsourced because it looked so good. And alright, these people have not been paying attention to Trails recently. Like, I love the way Sky the First looks. I'm going to be gushing about it a lot when I talk about the trailer, but it doesn't look better than the Daybreak games do. I would put it above the Cold Steel 3, 4, and Reverie engine, but This is clearly the Daybreak engine. It's optimized for the Switch because this is being developed for the Switch first, so it looks better than the Switch versions of the Daybreak games. But overall, run a Daybreak game on PC with decent settings or PS5 and it's gonna look better than this. Watch any Kai trailer or gameplay showcase and it looks better than this. That's not a knock on Sky the First. It is the exact visual style I would want a Sky remake to have, but it doesn't even look better than the best looking Trails games, so I don't get how it looks so much better that you would think not Falcom was making it. Maybe if you haven't been playing Trails since the original Sky, it would make sense, but nah, Falcom makes good looking stuff. They make games that look better than most other AA JRPGs, even ones that are made by literally Square. That being said, if Kondo is saying that some people out there are thinking Sky the First looks too good to have been made by Falcom, and is also surprised that Nintendo showed it off already, perhaps the footage we're seeing was not from a Switch 1 dev kit, and Kondo expected that the trailer he gave Nintendo would not have been used until some sort of Switch 2 presentation, and that the game looks so good because it's not running on Switch 1 hardware. This genuinely makes a lot of sense, and no matter when the Switch 2 ends up being revealed, we could very likely see a lot more Sky the First info later on. And yeah, this game could easily get ported to PlayStation and PC if it was being developed for a more powerful platform from the ground up, because it won't look like as cheap or low budget a game if it was being made for a better Switch than the one we're all currently using. As for other people who seem to have been caught off guard by this announcement, Mitsuki Saiga, Joshua's voice actress, was also seemingly unsure this was going to be announced, and whether or not this was because she also didn't think it would be announced now or hasn't been contacted about the project yet at all remains to be seen. This can't be taken as confirmation there won't be new voice acting as well, because we don't know if Saiga is feigning ignorance to hype people up or genuinely didn't know this was happening. And, well, Falcom makes games quickly. Daybreak 2 was apparently made in 8 months because they'd had to make another Trails game since East 10 was taking so long, and it still has the exact proportion of voice acting Daybreak 1 did. The lack of Daisuke Ono is because they couldn't afford more Daisuke Ono, not because they didn't have enough time to get him to record everything. And even on top of that, the dub is usually one of the last things done in the localization process too, so hey, there you go. This doesn't say anything about the voice acting. On the topic of sound though, we should probably touch on music, because this is a Falcom game after all. Despite several different pieces of video footage being shown off, unfortunately, besides generic direct background stuff and narration, we've only heard one track so far. That track is the non-vocal version of Whereabouts of Light from the We Love Sora no Kiseki album, which released in 2016 and contains arrangements of 11 tracks from across Trails in the Sky first chapter. You might notice this actually is more recent than the Evolution version of Trails in the Sky first chapter, which also included new versions of every song in the game. So it's possible that they will be using these versions of the songs and not rearranging them again purely because this is the most recent version of them. That being said, Sky FC's OST is significantly longer, and there's only one volume of We Love Sora no Kiseki, so that would only be those specific 11 tracks to draw from if they wanted to use that in the actual game. So there's a good chance this too is a placeholder, and either they will be using the Evolution tracks again, the original tracks again, or there will be a third version of the audio, and they simply do not have a finished version of it yet. More recent Falcom music is kind of controversial, and I don't really want to get into a full explanation of all that, but the Evo version of the Sky OST is also not the most liked version as well, so if the choices are that or a new version that's primarily going to be Singa again, I'm not sure how much people are going to actually like the soundtracks for these remakes, so I don't really know. There's also the Sora no Kiseki Zanmai album, which contains a few other tracks as well as rearrangements of some of the same songs that are in We Love, so there is a distinct possibility that they will be using a bunch of tracks from various cover albums that came out after the Evo version, while either using Evo or completely new arrangements to fill in the gaps. I will say, because we talked about Oath and Felghana a lot earlier in the video, that there's a good chance that this version of the game will do what that did. Oath and Felghana is a remake of Ys 3, and there were multiple different ports of Ys 3 prior to Felghana being made, which came on systems with significantly different audio hardware. So, in addition to the new arrangements that were all full CD quality in Oath and Felghana, there are also emulated versions of a lot of different OSTs going back to the original PC-88 version, and I could very easily see Trails in the Sky the First having 3 different options. One for the original, one for Evo, and one for whatever this new version is, though honestly if they want to use the original OST and have a toggle for Evo, I'd be completely fine with that too. Okay, now does anyone actually want to talk about the trailer now, or should I just make a second video later? Ignoring the Western Direct version because it is effectively the Japanese version with 3/4 removed, largely the parts with Japanese text, we open seeing just how beautiful this game really is going to be. I know I said it isn't really anything special compared to Daybreak, but I do have to say the lighting in the first is a significant step up from any other Trails game, including the previous ones using this engine. It also seems like material design has taken a massive step up too, as things that are metallic are reflecting light a lot better than they have in any other Falcom game, and this is very, very noticeable on the metal on Estelle's outfit. While I'm a big fan of the Daybreak aesthetic already, these little improvements make it look all that much better, even if on a pure technical level the game doesn't actually improve on them whatsoever, especially because it is on the Switch to some degree. I would be interested in seeing if Sky the First is the first game where we will be seeing these improvements made, or if they'll make their way into Kai no Kiseki, or even Tokyo Xanadu 2, which we haven't seen anything of yet, because that is likely to release before this. Anyway, the cutscene showing is basically just the first one after the flashback at the beginning of the game of Estelle meeting Joshua out on the balcony, and when it zooms in on her, in addition to seeing how the metal looks, we can also see the shine in her eyes is also incredibly improved over any previous game, and again, despite her actual model basically resembling a character from a Daybreak game, and it could very easily be taken geometry from someone that I just can't remember off the top of my head. Look, all the better. It then cuts to gameplay, and we see something completely mind-blowing. Estelle, on her own, no Joshua in sight, which is also interesting, walking north on the Elias Highway past her own home, and first off, we can see that there are enemies present, and normally in this area, enemies do not spawn until you get south of the fork in the road that leads to either the city of Roland or the Bright family house. So again, either this is a dev build and they just have enemy spawns places where they wouldn't normally be, or things are changed up and there's instead just a story flag that makes enemies spawn, because presumably they won't be there before your tutorial fight on the way to the city for the first time. Additionally, while it does jump cut when she gets close to the gates of the city, you can see her walking through them and see an icon that says Roland City pop up in the top of the screen. There are seamless area transitions in this game. That's extremely impressive. We'll see it more clearly in another trailer, but she walks through the gate of Roland from the Elias Highway, and she's just in the city of Roland. That's not a thing that happens in any other game in the series, really. While yes, you could make the argument that Sky areas are smaller, so they could load more in at once, that's not really true. If you scaled up Sky areas to the character proportions of any 3D Trails game, you'll see they are about the same size. So they did manage to have at least the entirety of Roland and at least the north bit of the Elias Highway loaded at once, which is fairly impressive by Falcom standards. We can't really tell if the entirety of Liberl is going to be connected, or if it's going to be loaded as in the entire Roland region will be there at once outside of houses and dungeons or that kind of thing. But either way, it's cool. Maybe they've used that technology in Ys games before and they're finally adding it to Trails as an experimental thing for a remake, but it remains to be seen how connected things are, though I'm impressed, and I think it would be really, really nice if things like, say, the entire Elias Highway were connected, because that's 3 entire screens in the original, and I think if an area that long was put in a Daybreak game, they could probably put it on one screen, so I'm pretty optimistic. As Estelle walks through Roland, you can see some very familiar NPCs now rendered in 3D for the first time, and this is a very faithful adaptation of the original game. One thing that I was thinking they might actually do was increase the technology level overall throughout Liberl, because Kondo has stated in the past that if you were to say, go back and revisit the city of Zeiss during the time of Daybreak, it would look completely different because of how fast technology has evolved in the few short years the series has been going on. But despite that, even just visiting Crossbell once makes Laboro look like a technological backwater despite the highly regarded and advanced technology company they have. And the fact that they are still seen as a major player in the Western Zemirian stage doesn't really make sense if the entire country's a backwater, but it looks like they're being very, very faithful, at least in Roland. We haven't seen the entirety of Laboral, but I could also very easily see them distinguish the major cities from each other a little bit more and say, make the buildings in Rouen look more different than the buildings in Bose. So my guess would be that Roland and Gransel are going to be the cities that are the most like the original versions, but in order to not be as asset reusey as the original games were, some of the other cities will have their more own distinct visual identities, more similar to how the major cities in Erebonia and Calvard look a bit more different than each other than the ones in Laboral do. Next up are introductions to Estelle and Joshua, and these both appear to be taken from the Milch main road to the west of Roland, and it is just them doing their victory poses with the UI and stuff removed so you could see better. Continuing the trend of extremely faithful remaking of things, these do appear to be their poses from the original game, as you can very clearly see Estelle start winding up for the peace sign before it cuts to Joshua. And while I'm here, talking about character design, while yes, their actual in-game models do appear to be bodged together from various Daybreak assets that already existed, their actual designs do harken back to the original Sky games far more than any iteration of them. This is very clearly noticeable with Estelle, as her eyes are much redder than they've been in a very, very long time. Pretty much everywhere outside the original trilogy, including some parts of art in the Evo versions, her eyes are a lot closer to her hair color, but here, they're basically red, which is what they were supposed to be from her art in the first Sky games and her portraits and all that stuff, but it seems to be completely lost over time, so it's nice seeing that detail back. This leaves me very excited for how they're going to depict other characters that haven't been seen in 3D in a while, or at all in the case of Annalise, and I really hope they do make a unique younger Zin model and don't just port his Daybreak one over, because that would be a little lame, honestly. We next see the pair approaching the Asmelos Tower, and they made a few interesting changes here. The first is that the green on the outside at least is a lot more muted, which makes sense, it's an old tower and should be faded, though it is still obviously the green one, and there are plenty of more emerald colored green windows in it that set that off really well. The second is that the vegetation around the tower is a lot yellower than it is in the original game, which doesn't suggest anything about the season or anything, because later wide shots of Roland will show that the entire mountainous area to the north of the city has this yellower vegetation as a way to set it out, which makes sense. If the entire point of the game is that you're going around different regions of Laboral, seeing what makes each unique and learning to appreciate it and protect it as bracers, it would be good to switch up the very repetitive asset tiles in the original games and give each area a more distinct identity. This is like I said for the cities, but they're clearly doing it, and they're doing it with environmental areas as well. Another change is the shape of the tower. Honestly, looking at them from the outside in the original games, they looked a lot taller than the 5 floors and a roof that they actually are, whereas this version very clearly is a squat round thing that's only a few stories tall, but still taller than basically every other building in the country. The next shot is Estelle and Joshua browsing the request board at the Roland Guild, which is indicated by the fact that you can see Aina in the background, and unfortunately the light is shining on the board, and the new lighting means we can't read any of the text, so it's hard to tell if they borrowed really funny things for the textures like they did in the Daybreak Bracer Guilds. We then cut to an over-the-shoulder shot of Aina talking to the pair, and I'm not sure if this is from the same cutscene, because there are obviously several of her talking to the two of them, but the important thing is this is a dynamic camera angle that was not possible in the 2.5D original game. It just wouldn't work with the way the sprites are laid out, even if the environment itself was in 3D. So it's good to see that even more static shots from the original game are getting different camera angles, taking advantage of the fact that this is a remake, even if the layout and gameplay and all that is extremely faithful. While the outside shot of the city clearly kept the exact same layout and the same shaped buildings in the same places, seeing the staircase to the second floor of the guild house in this shot does make me think about whether or not they'll change the layout of the interiors of buildings, as it's kind of a meme that interiors of buildings earlier on in the series, especially in the Sky games, really don't make a lot of sense, and they start paying more attention to detail in that realm later on in the series, especially in Daybreak. For instance, none of the guild branches anywhere in Sky actually have any beds in them, despite it being a plot point that Estelle and Joshua do typically stay overnight in the local guild branch throughout the entirety of first chapter, and some hotel rooms make actively zero sense. Like, there'll just be 4 beds in a 2x2 grid in one corner of the room, then like an entire dining room table, some random chairs and an extra couch on a wall, and then a bathroom that just has a bathtub in it without even a sink, let alone a toilet. So something's telling me they're going to update that kind of thing, as well as perhaps adding additional floors to some buildings, and just have it partitioned off so you can't go there, but you can tell that there's a staircase leading up to somewhere else that wasn't there in the original game, where you can just kind of assume things that aren't present in the playable area are. I'm fairly certain, again with easing the technology curve a little bit early on in the series, that especially Zeiss and Grancel's buildings are going to have a couple extra stories added to them in some places, just so it's a little bit more congruent with later games. Better matching in-universe technology levels is one thing, but also updating the visuals of Liberl to match what better technology in the real world was able to render is also kind of important, because even older seeming buildings in Erebonia tend to have more stories to them than their Liberlian counterparts, and small houses wedged in the backstreets of the old town of Calvard's capital are bigger and more furnished and have better bathrooms than some rich people's houses in Sky. The next shot is of Estelle and Joshua running around the overworld. According to the minimap, they're moving northeast in what seems to be a large open green region with plant enemies, so yeah, I'm guessing this is just the Milch main road to the west of Roland. I think we finally need to at least start talking about gameplay here, because Estelle runs up to one of these enemies that's called Lily Mover in the English version of the original game, hits it with her staff, and initiates a battle. On my first few viewings of these trailers, it looks to me like Sky First was going to be taking Daybreak's visual engine, but primarily having a battle system based around the Cold Steel 3 through Reverie iteration, but the more I see, the more it does appear to be an altered Daybreak battle system rather than an old one. While the full action overworld combat might not be present, a lot of other elements that suggest this is most similar to Daybreak are. First off, we can see on the overworld, expanding the minimap into the full map is down on the D-pad like it's been for ages now, but the purposes of the face buttons have significantly changed. Y appears to be attack, X craft, A arts, and then B defend, which is especially interesting as defend was not a command until Daybreak, so it obviously was not present in the original Sky games. We do also see the enemies shoot projectiles that Estelle runs around before hitting to initiate a battle, and while the turn tracker UI element does legitimately just appear to be a reskin version of the Cold Steel 3 one instead of Daybreak's different version on the top of the screen, the completely seamless battle transition is also pulled directly from the Calvard arc. Another clue is that we can see Estelle actually start her turn here, and while she doesn't input any actions, she is walking around normally without using any sort of move command. So it looks like battles are going to use the Daybreak movement formula of you being able to freely move your character within their movement range on a turn, and then input an action, instead of only being able to choose a move action, or only move to an enemy to get in range to use an attack or craft. So you can move and use an art in the same turn here, and I'm going to assume Daybreak's defend command has been added so that you have an option to just pass a turn, which is what the simple move action would have been in the original games. The face button layout, though, is completely different from either of those battle systems, which is kind of weird. The Cold Steel 3 through Reverie system had A attack, B move, Y art, and X craft, while Daybreak was A attack, X item, Y art, R craft, and B to flee. And really, I just have to assume this current configuration is some sort of placeholder, because I can't really see them letting you use crafts in the overworld when that's more complex than even Daybreak 2 let you do. That introduced arts for the first time in overworld combat. And I don't think defend would be defend in an action battle. I would assume it would be some sort of evasion thing. So my guess would be that they are going to change things before the next time we see this game, because literally every single Trails game that's playable with a Nintendo controller uses A for attack, and even most of the modern East games do so as well, so I'm really hoping this does get tweaked. In the enemy info box, we can see that its name is still Ririmuba in Japanese, so presumably as long as the translation stays reasonably the same, it's still going to be Lily Mover in English, and that pressing minus does something, which is almost certainly bringing up the detailed status screen for the enemy, like it is when playing a Daybreak game with a Switch controller. We can also see that something new has been added to the Sky games. There is a down meter underneath the enemy's HP that has 0% to 2%, suggesting that if Estelle uses a regular attack, the meter will go up to 2%. This appears to be the stun meter from the Daybreak games just renamed, so yeah, this seems to legitimately be, minus all the Zifa specific mechanics, Daybreak 1's battle system, just using Sky characters with presumably the same crafts from those games, and as we'll see later, the same arts from the original Sky FC. We can also see that enemy stats are also rebalanced to account for this change, because 181 is more HP than any incarnation of the Lily Mover you could have in any difficulty of Sky First Chapter, and it appears to have been given an additional elemental weakness, as in the original game, Lily Movers took double damage from fire and neutral damage from all the other elements, but here it's weak to both fire and wind, though we don't get to see the enhanced info, so we're not sure whether its fire weakness is still that high and what the wind weakness is. Quickly going back to the beginning of this clip, another thing that hints at Daybreak style everything is the amount of enemies visible on the minimap at once, which is very similar to what you'd see in Daybreak, but way more than you would in a Cold Steel game, because in those games, each overworld enemy represented multiple in-battle enemies and there was a separate battle screen, while in the latter, there is no separate battle screen, it takes place right in the overworld, and each overworld enemy is one in-battle enemy. This is also confirmed by the second Lily Mover that was behind the first one, also joining the battle when Estelle hits it, as we can see two of them going in between Estelle and Joshua, and according to its flavor text from the original game, Lily Movers are not capable of moving at all, despite the name, I guess, and not only do neither of these actually move on the overworld, only rotate, there's no way something that can't walk is able to move twice before Joshua gets to move once, so that has to be two different Lily Movers engaged at the same time. The next clip also shows the pair fighting a very familiar enemy. They're facing off against the Rhinocider, which is a quest enemy on the Elize Highway, again in the prologue of the original FC. Here we can see Estelle scrolling through the arts menu, and something else that very heavily suggests the UI is a work in progress is the fact that we never actually see her press the button to go to the arts menu. The clip starts already scrolling through that, so it's likely that that kind of thing has not been fully programmed or in a presentable UI state. And interestingly enough, despite the Lily Mover gaining more HP, the Rhinocider appears to be significantly weaker, as not only does it have less HP than it does even on normal mode in the original game, but it gained weaknesses to 3 elements when it used to have none. This is also very clearly dev footage, as we see Estelle scroll through way more arts than she should ever have access to at this point in the game, and in fact, the list is actually every single offensive art in the original Sky First chapter of first Earth, then Water, then Fire, and the first wind art we see is Airstrike, so she probably has all of those as well. Though eventually the player does choose to click on Firebolt EX, which has a hugely inflated EP cost from the original game as well, using it and causing a big explosion before the scene cuts again. We'll talk about what we can see when the camera angle shifts to show the explosion, but first let's talk about all the arts here. While we can't see any flavor text for any of these arts, the EP cost has obviously changed for many of them, and we can also see what the AoE is, so we can comment on that as well. It's also worth noting that the delay on the arts has either been significantly tweaked, or the speed has been set up in such a way as to facilitate this clip, or everything except Estelle is on a 0 speed stat, because no matter what art she chooses, Estelle is always going to cast it immediately before the Rhinocider or Joshua can act. First off, Stone Hammer remains 10 EP, will now increase the down gauge by 3%, and is a small cone instead of a single target attack. Petrify Breath is actually listed before Earth Lance, surprisingly enough, and goes from 30 EP to 60, from a single target attack to a circle with a decent radius, and increases down gauge by 6%. It gets a little hard to see now because the scrolling speed increases and the AoE changes before the actual cursor lists the next art, but from what I can tell, Earth Lance now is 135 EP instead of 20, and is either single target or small targeted circle, and increases the gauge by 11%. Stone Impact's EP cost has been increased from 50 to also 135. Its new AoE is the exact same cone as Stone Hammer, and it also increases the gauge by 11. Titanic Roar's EP cost has been increased from 50 to a whopping 375, which is more than I think most characters in the original Sky First chapter can get, period. It still hits all targets, and it increases the gauge by 19. Aqua Bleed retains its 10 EP cost, though instead of being single target, it is a line, and switching to water shows that the Rhinocider now has a 500% weakness to the element, which I have to remind you, it used to take neutral damage from. And presumably because of the weakness, Aqua Bleed also increases the down gauge by 19%, the same the ultimate Earth attack did. Blue Impact's cost has increased from 20 to 60. With the weakness, it does a 32% on the down gauge, and not only is the circle around the enemy extremely small, the arrow disappears from the ground and appears instead over the enemy, so it looks like this is a single target attack, and every other art we've seen so far is a placed AoE instead of one centered around the target. This is a pretty big departure because besides Stone Impact and Titanic Roar, everything I've talked about so far was single target. Titanic Roar was all targets, and Stone Impact was centered on the target, while these are all placed AoEs. This is probably just a work in progress still, but at the same time, that is a massive deviation from the original game. I'm not about to go into the full comparison, but upon looking things up later, this is definitely a placeholder for a lot of things, as the EP costs are very close to, and the AoE ranges are identical to similar arts from the same element from Daybreak 1, so this is 100% based on the Daybreak engine and battle system, because they haven't programmed the Sky arts into the game yet and are just using Daybreak ones renamed as placeholders. Anyway though, Diamond Dust does appear to be a placed AoE like it used to be, though the radius seems to be significantly larger than it was in the original FC. It now deals 70% down gauge with the weakness, and its EP cost has been increased from 40 to 360. Switching over to Fire, Rhinocider does now take 200% damage from it when it was neutral in the original game. Firebolt retains its 10 EP and single target effect, and now it also does 7 down gauge with the weakness. Next up is Flare Arrow, which does 12 down gauge with the weakness. Its EP cost was increased from 20 to 60, and it's a placed cone instead of another single target. Napalm Breath goes from again single target to a large placed AoE. EP cost went from 40 to 135, and it deals 18% down gauge. Lastly, the art Estelle finally chooses is Firebolt EX, which has its 20 EP cost increased also to 135. Its radius around target appears to now be a placed AoE, and it does 18% gauge with the weakness. Additionally, below that, we can also see the Japanese names for Spiral Flare, Volcanic Rave, and Airstrike, which are just the next 3 offensive arts in the line. After selecting the art, the camera changes position and pans up to allow the animation to play out, and we could see 2 very interesting things there. The first is that the sky is a little darker than you would think, even with being lit up by fire, and there are stars visible, suggesting that this is actually nighttime. And then also, you can see an airship flying above. So it looks like they're really leaning into Liberl being the airship country, and you'll just be able to see the public transportation ships flying above you while you're playing the game. This is incredibly charming, and one of my favorite changes they've made in the remake so far, but as the ships do show up again in other shots, I'm going to talk about them more later. As for it being nighttime, it could just be that the time of day will change when the time of day does in the story, but there is also a possibility that there will be some sort of dynamic time of day changing, the likes of which has never been seen in the series before. It does seem like it's just twilight and not full nighttime based on the lighting prior to when Estelle starts using the art, but if I'm thinking correctly, there's no evening or nighttime where you're also allowed to fight the Rhinocider, so Maybe they just were messing around with the skyboxes and decided to leave it there for mixing up the visuals a little bit, since a lot of things are just samey Roland region looking stuff. Or there is some sort of dynamic time of day changing thing, and honestly that would be good. Something I would love them to do is make the timeline a lot more concrete. One of my favorite things about the later games is that we know exactly what day every single gameplay portion of every chapter of every game takes place on. And with Sky, it's a lot more nebulous and hard to pin down. You're only forced to sleep overnight a handful of times during the entirety of Sky First Chapter, and yet it takes place canonically over several months based on context clues. So I would love for them to nail down exact dates, and while it might cause some issues in a few areas, especially if you just stand around and several days pass and you just miss the time the next story beat's supposed to take place, honestly, First Chapter really feels like it only takes place over a couple weeks when you're playing through it, but we know as a fact it must have been several months based on character birthdays and when the year changes in its second chapter, so this would lend a lot to that verisimilitude to make you actually believe it takes place over longer times. Mercifully, things get less dense again as we're brought back to the Roland Bracer Guild, this time a close-up of Aina talking, again presumably to Estelle and Joshua. There's not really much else to say here, other than if you've played any Daybreak game, you can clearly see Aina's face sculpt is taken from there, and at the very least they're not increasing the level of technology in the Bracer Guild's phones, as it's still using the old-timey, sort of rotary phone-looking design, which again I have to remind you, tactical orbments have cell phones in them 2 years after this. We do though get to see another example of the much more detailed cinematography in the remake versus the original, as checking the line Aina's saying here confirms that it's her first telling Estelle, Joshua, and Shara about the airliner going missing, and the next shot is the camera now focused on their reaction, and Estelle's exclamation of disbelief at this. And yep, there's our first glimpse of Sherazard Harvey in the remake. She doesn't get a cool intro like Estelle and Joshua did, and like Aina, you can see that she is very, very clearly, again, drawing facial geometry from the Daybreak games. We do not get any new 2D art for her here, but given how all of the Evo versions, which were less of a remake than these were by far, had new art for every single major character, we're definitely going to get it for her, as well as probably multiple other pieces of Joshua and Estelle. This is, however, the end of the Nintendo Direct trailer, as the next thing that shows up is the logo, a footnote saying that it's subject to change, and the release date of 2025. Fortunately, or unfortunately for you, depending on how sunk costed into this video you are by now, there is a second trailer, this one being 2 minutes and 6 seconds long, so way longer than the first. This game opens, once again flexing the lighting improvements, with the second floor of the Bright family home, looking up from the staircase after climbing it. This is probably a POV shot of Estelle at some point, but it's unknown if it's during the flashback at the very beginning of the game, or something right when the present day picks up, and we maybe get to see her morning routine before she goes out on the balcony and talks to Joshua for the first time, which of course we have already seen him playing the harmonica. We then cut to Estelle and Joshua on top of the Roland Clock Tower in what I assume is going to be their heart-to-heart scene in the prologue. Based on the orientation of everything, it appears the pair are looking west out of the city in the direction of the Milch Main Road, and that the corner of the tower the camera is closest to is the northwest one, so we're looking in a southeasterly direction. Based on the layout of the city in the original games, the building directly to the right of the clock tower from our view should be the Bracer Guild, then the weapon shop past that, and not only can you directly see the guild emblem over the door in the first few frames of this, but everything also completely lines up with the shot from the other trailer of Estelle running into town, so again, the map does appear to be the exact same, just adapted into 3D. Additionally, as the shot pans further, we can see not only the red roof of the Hotel Roland on the left, but also the stained glass windows of the Roland Chapel on the right, confirming those are also in their traditional spots. On top of that, if you go back to the very beginning, and look at the lower left corner of the screen, you can see a stone archway and another building behind that. This is Mayor Klaus's manor, something which was a different loading zone from the majority of Roland in the original games, and not visible from it in any cutscene, again suggesting that many areas from the original Sky FC are going to be combined into one loading zone for the remake. At the very least, we have the top third of Eli's Highway, the majority of Roland, and the exterior of the mayor's residence combined into one here, so I would not be surprised if entire dungeons are on one loading zone, as well as all segments of major overworld routes being combined. This is further shown by the panning continuing upward and around, getting us glimpses of the garden outside the mayor's residence, and the fact that the town's square wall extends to encompass it, and also starts panning up, showing several things. Firstly, the weather vane, confirming that Estelle and Joshua were in fact facing west. Secondly, the grass to the north of Roland is the exact same yellow we saw outside the Ismelis Tower earlier, so it looks like that entire more mountainous region is getting a complete visual overhaul. And then finally, and most importantly, it looks like the landing port is also completely loaded in here, and this shows something that is present in the original games, but I didn't notice until I went back and checked after seeing this, and that is that the dock at the Roland landing port is not completely north-south, it is a little bit skewed northeast-southwest. Now, this is less than one button press rotation of the camera in the original games, and it looks like the angle's been increased to roughly 30 degrees off of directly north-south, but even this is a faithful adaptation. This isn't an embellishment to make the layout of the city more interesting for the remake. It was always like this, we just couldn't notice, and Falcom still kept track of it. The trailer fades to white before we can actually see out west of the city, but it does pan far enough to see part of the gate that leads up to the Malga Trail, as well as a lot of Malga Mountain content, which is unfortunately too far away and YouTube compressed for me to make a good judgment as to whether or not it's all loaded in, or you will need to go through a loading zone to get there gameplay-wise. But more importantly, we can see the Ismelis Tower. And based on the exterior shots we got, this is most of the tower visible from here, meaning it's very high up relative to Roland, so it's going to be very noticeable that you're climbing a mountain as you go up the Malga Trail in the remake, which is neat, and also has me very excited for the views from the top of all four of the tetracyclic towers, as those were just 2D textures in the original games, and while they still looked good, I really want to see what they can do with the graphics in the remake. Even if it's not the most spectacular thing in the world and we do just primarily get a bunch of copy-pasted 3D trees instead of a hand-drawn 2D texture, I do at least expect to get a neat view of Roland from above, which was not available in the original game, as the tops of all the towers there have a locked camera angle facing northeast. So while there was a great view, all you could get was the mountains to the northeast of the tower, so more or less just the uninhabited tri-point with Erebonia and Calvard instead of anything interesting within Laboral itself. The fade to white brings us to the absolutely beautiful Kiseki series 20th anniversary logo, which I am not about to criticize them not putting this in any English material because, well, it's not called Kiseki in English, and it has not been 20 years since that version of Sky FC. But most importantly, the Sky FC tactical orbment being the 0 in the 20 gives me hope that at the very least they'll restock the pocket watch based on it, and maybe if we're really lucky, they'll make more Sky-related merch equal to the amount of random Cold Steel stuff they've been dropping for literally 10 years now, because the original games predate Falcom's new strategy of just making random merch of everything and throwing it out there hoping someone buys it. And I don't know, maybe if some Sky stuff succeeds, we can finally get some good Daybreak merch besides the one Elaine figure that's 2 games out of date and 1 model kit. Honestly, with Sky, they created this very unique Clockwork-inspired, somewhat steampunky, somewhat not aesthetic that's very unique to these games only, so I kind of have to give it its own unique name of Orbalpunk, and as the series progressed, they just kept flattening that out to a very generic, sleek, and polished, modern/slight future sci-fi fantasy that's almost identical to any JRPG in a similar setting, and that's a real disappointment, so I'm very glad that the gears are back in the UI and all that, and so much stuff is faithful to the original Sky, because that gives me hope that the next arc after Daybreak is also going to go for something a bit more unique, now that we've also seen they're doing another big step up in graphical prowess, so maybe they'll also be able to go for something more stylized instead of using the same general look for Trails East and Tokyo Xanadu. Anyway, we get the balcony scene again, and then Falcom very mercifully starts doing my work for me and directly comparing shots of the remake to the original game. The first is a very extended version of the shot of Estelle running down the Eli's Highway from the direct trailer, and this time it doesn't jump cut before she reaches the edge of Roland, so we can actually see her pass directly into the city with no loading zone, compared to the shot of the original game going through a black screen and loading, as well as her putting her weapon away as she reaches the edge of the town. One way it does seem like the remake has improved the technology of Laboral is by making the roads much better maintained. As you can clearly see, there are patches where there's just grass overgrowing the road in the original game, and obviously you can remember that if you played the Sky Arc yourself, where here it's not necessarily wider, but it's fully cobblestoned the entire way and even has a little dirt margin at the side. So honestly, that just makes sense given how old Roman roads stayed in use in the real world. Them falling into this much disrepair while they were actively the main roads of a fairly well-off kingdom doesn't really make sense, so this just makes Laboral seem a bit more realistic, I suppose. We can also tell that the proportions of the original maps have not been directly scaled up to match with the new character models, as the clip of the original game starts right at the sign where the road branches off to go to the Bright family house, but Estelle is clearly past that fork in the road in the remake. Also, just by comparing the little snippet of minimap we can see here to the full map from the original game, it does look like the entire area has been widened, so the grass to the side of the road is also larger, which would make sense if there are going to be more enemies in the style of Daybreak. Above Roland, we can also see an airship flying low, and I'm going to assume it makes a sharp turn north, because that is not lined up with either where the dock is or the orientation of the dock. But either way, it's still amazing getting to actually see the airships just out and about in the world, and I think it's going to add so much to the world building and just vibes of being in this setting, which is another thing I think the Sky Arc has done in a way that nothing later has ever really been able to match. Just the vibes of being in this specific unique country in a fantasy world. Entering the city once again shows that the layout of Roland is basically identical to how it was in the original games, and that the mini-maps in this remake are going to be very similar to the Daybreak ones, with effectively just a change of color, though most curiously we can see that there is a dot for an interactable NPC on the clock tower, which suggests that they're removing loading zones from entering buildings that were in the original game as well, because you had to go through 2 of them to get to the top of the clock tower in the original, but here, at the very least, going up the tower will put you on the same base Roland map instead of a completely unique one, because they're showing off the NPC just from the ground level of the city. The next clip is of the scene of the airship Lind docking at Roland, and there's not really much else to say. They increased the amount of fins on the turbines on the airship, which I guess is neat and makes more sense. They seemed to have increased the amount of windows on the top front bit of it, so that's kind of cool. And honestly, I guess the most interesting thing here is that the color has actually been significantly changed from the original game. It is a lot more of an olive green than a light tan here. So, I don't know, I guess I can theorize that the Cecilia's color is going to be changed to a more vibrant green, so it's harder to mix them up. Yeah, that's all I got here. The next shot is from much later in the same scene after Cassius departs on the Lind. His line corresponds to him saying, "He's gone again," and Estelle saying, "Yeah," in the English version. And the main thing here is just once again a change in camera angle. The original game could not support this low angle aiming up at the sky watching the airship leave, which is obviously completely different from the original game's top-down isometric perspective and makes a lot more sense for, you know, a thing about airships. We next get another shot of running through Roland, this time at sunset, and this time Shara is actually in the party, so we can get a little glimpse of what her artwork for the remake is going to be. But more importantly, they are running south into the main area of the city, and we can see that they came from the airship landing based on the minimap and comparing it to the original game, but also that beyond a shadow of a doubt, that is loaded in at the same time, as we can see how long the trail behind the arrow representing the player is, and its tail end is not only off-screen, but far past where the loading zone in the original was. And on top of that, in the lower right-hand corner of the minimap, we can see what appears to be the start of the Malga Trail, again on the same map as Roland. In the original, the loading zone would be right where it thins out to that little bit, which is where the gate is, but that and a much wider part into the wilds beyond is there, so we really might be looking at each of the 5 regions of Laboral, besides maybe certain dungeons, being one loading zone, which is incredible by Falcom standards, and I'm honestly genuinely proud of them for making this major step up amongst all the other major projects they've been undertaking recently. The next shot is just the lily mover from the original trailer, but then we get a new piece of overworld exploration, and this is very unique. First off, we are on the Malga Trail. Second off, Estelle is alone in the party, which to me suggests this is just dev footage. I can't remember this ever happening in the original game. And third off, it's impossible to cross-reference the minimap with the original minimap. So again, it seems like overworld areas and maybe even some dungeons will be expanded to compensate for more enemies being around and to make the exploration more fun. So it's impossible to identify exactly where this would be relative to the original game, but there are also beetle enemies here. Those were not present anywhere in the Roland region in the original FC. The flying felines were Malga Trail enemies initially, but these guys just weren't there to begin with. We can also see a little back icon pop up underneath the one to the right of Estelle when she gets to the back of it, and that goes away when she gets alongside it, so it seems like regardless of what the out-of-turn-based battle combat is going to look like, there is going to be some advantage to back attacks once again. The Japanese text on screen here machine translates to battles that change seamlessly from fields to command, so that could really mean full Daybreak pseudo-action combat, or just the same kind of really quick battle transitions that were existing from Cold Steel 3 onwards, and the fact that there appears to also be a breakable jar to the left of the path underneath the text on the bottom level there at the end of the clip doesn't really add anything else because, again, those existed in earlier games before Daybreak. But if this is Daybreak style, then maybe that would have more EP recovery like in those games, which possibly could justify the extremely ballooned EP costs for almost every art. The next clip is a truncated version of the Rhinocider one, and then things get really fun because the screen splits in 4. Yippee! For the first set of clips, the top left corner is an extended version of Estelle and Joshua running up to the Ismelis Tower. We can see that, yup, this sure is the Malga Trail because there are those new beetle enemies there. The top right clip is Estelle on her own running into the entrance to the Mistwald, which is very exciting because we could see the sign present at the entrance to the forest in the original game right at the beginning of the clip. And say it with me again, that sign was on the Elize Highway side of the loading zone. So it looks like this is also the same loading zone as maybe not necessarily all of Roland and the top bit of the highway, but the bottom bit of the highway, which is still a lot more than the original game. It looks like since this is a dungeon or just general overworld enemy where areas are present, that it has also been expanded because it looks a lot larger than the first screen of that in the original game, and I don't know, Estelle shouldn't be there alone at any time, so that's kind of neat. I worry for her, especially because she has 154 HP, 50 EP, and 200 CP at every shot and every piece of material we've been shown so far. That's not going to cut it on her own in the Mistwald. Bottom left-hand corner is just Shara saying something. Cross-referencing in Trails in the database again shows that this is her talking about how Estelle and Joshua need to get recommendations from the other guild branches from the scene basically at the end of the prologue right after they get their recommendation from the Roland one. The angle is off from any other shot of this we've seen, but it appears that we are from Estelle or Joshua's POV looking directly at Shara, standing at the front desk of the Roland Guild, as that potted plant is present on the end of it in the wider shots, as well as the table we can see on the left side. At first I thought this was actually a different location, like maybe the second floor of the guild hall, but it looks like this scene's taking place exactly where it did in the original, so I doubt we're going to get that big deviations except for new content. Bottom right is in fact something I was talking about before, as this is the party from the top of the Ismelis Tower looking in a southerly direction. There's an airship flying around below the roof of the tower, which is extremely cool, but we can also see some roads in this direction. At the beginning of the clip, the camera is pointed almost due southwest, and based on geography, that should be where the Verte Bridge is, and yeah, it is actually there. For the longest time, I was very confused, thinking the river it crossed was some like blue-gray stone road that goes in a different direction from any road in the original game, and that what is actually the bridge was just some kind of gateway. But then I realized that they've been willing to slightly rotate elements of geography already, and that the bridge is due east-west in the original game, so it would probably be somewhat close to that in the remake, and as such would be more perpendicular than parallel to the line of sight from the top of the tower in this direction. But yeah, once the camera starts panning to the left a little bit, you can see the cobblestones of the Milch Main Road going left to right and then ending at a little brownish area, which appears to be the dirt fields surrounding the checkpoint on the Roland side, and then the bridge over the river. You can just barely see some of the dirt on the Bose side as well, and I'm assuming that at some point along there is going to be a loading zone for the entire Bose region, but the fact that you can directly pinpoint this kind of thing from the top of the Ismaelis Tower, which is almost as far within the Roland region as you can get from either of the checkpoints on either end of it, is very exciting. And then, after all of that, the camera pans to the left so that we're facing almost directly south. And while yeah, there's the Milch Main Road along the way, we could also see a north-south road that I'm pretty sure is the Elias Highway. And all of Roland is just blocked behind the cliff. The only issue with this is you can't really make out where the branch off to go to the Bright House would be, the house itself, or the Mistwald, so it's kind of hard to tell which part of the highway is actually visible here. And earlier on, when you could see a little bit further out, you can't even see the wall surrounding the Grancel region where the south end of the Elias Highway is, so I'm really not sure what segment of road that actually is. I guess it could also be the road heading south to the Purcell Farm off of the Milch Main Road, but I can't see the Purcell Farm from here either, and we're going to get clips of it later on, and it doesn't quite look like that, so I'm not quite sure what to make of this. Either way, though, we can see a massive amount of the Roland region from here, and while I am kind of guessing that the tower itself will be its own loading zone, the fact that they can even render this much is genuinely exciting, and not just by Falcom standards, but by Switch RPG that looks like this standards. Speaking of the Purzells, there's Tio Purcell, the Chloe lookalike who had her name stolen by a Crossbell character. And yeah, she looks a lot like 3D depictions of Chloe, which is really funny. I wonder if they're going to use this exact face sculpt for like the actual Chloe in this remake. Anyway, I think this dialogue is just from the side quest that takes place in the farm. We'll get a better shot of the farm later, so there's not really much to talk about here. What's more to talk about, though, is the Malga Mine in the top right. We have Estelle on her own for some reason, and yeah, it looks like the layout of at least the first floor of this dungeon is going to remain as it was. In the bottom left, we can see Joshua leading the party for the first time with the same HP and EP totals he had in the battle scenes earlier on. I don't think anyone was expecting that you wouldn't be able to control characters other than Estelle out of battle, but hey, there's your confirmation. They are actually outside the Roland region for the first time, being at the Kingfisher Inn at the Valeria Lakeshore in the Bose region, and this is a fan favorite area, so I'm glad to see it rendered so lovingly and faithfully. Lastly, we're back at the Purcell farm, and there's the Crop Muncher, also from the same side quest as Tio's dialogue, and that's neat. I don't really have much else to say here. We'll get a couple extra screenshots of this later on. Ina's talking for a bit. She goes through 2 text boxes. This is just a slightly extended version of the scene of her telling about the airship going missing from the other trailer. I guess the only thing worth pointing out is that I haven't mentioned that the icon for auto-advancing text has been present in every text box so far. I don't think this is a surprise for anyone. It's been in more Trails games than it has not at this point. And this does not tell us anything about the state of voice acting, as you can auto-advance any text, even NPC dialogue, from outside of cutscenes. Estelle and Joshua are then spotlighted in that order. They're doing their victory poses again, and unfortunately Estelle's cuts off before you can see the peace sign, but hey, even this kind of thing is being faithfully recreated in 3D, which has me very on board for this remake. Honestly, the thing about the visuals that have me the most impressed aren't just how good everything looks, but how well they captured the vibes of not only the original game, but the era it came out in. This does not look like a ground-up remake of a 2.5D PC and PSP game from 2004. This looks like a remaster that had a lot of love poured into it of a 3D JRPG from like the PS2 from the same time. And that is the biggest compliment I can possibly give this. Obviously, the two series are very different, but it almost seems like there was some kind of lost Tales of game in between Symphonia and Abyss that's getting a remaster for the Switch, and maybe even an enhanced version of that for the Switch 2 in 2025, and that's what we're looking at instead of a very good-looking remake of a Kiseki game. The joke is that there actually is a Tales of game that came out in 2004 and has never been translated. Maybe Bamco should get on that after they do the Xenosaga remasters. Lastly, we have Estelle running on her own on what I'm assuming is still the Milch Main Road. with an airship above and the MLS tower to her right. Interestingly, the enemies are not on the road, which is to be expected, of course, but more so than that, the MLS tower seems a bit lower relative to Estelle compared to how it was from the clock tower scene in Roland, so I'm thinking the Milch Main Road might be a little hillier than it appeared in the original game, and you're actually going to be going up in elevation, then maybe down into a valley a little bit for the river crossing, and back up into the mountains on the Bose Highway, which does actually track with how mountainous that region of Liberal's always been described and how it was depicted in the originals. I promise we're almost done here, we just have a few miscellaneous screenshots from the official website to talk about. I'm just going to go through them in order, and go through them quickly unless there's something interesting in them. First one is just Joshua playing the harmonica again. The next is another shot of the scene of Cassius leaving on the airship. This is also after he leaves, and the line that in the English version is Estelle saying, "He's always been away more than he's been at home." Next is Estelle and Joshua talking at what I believe is the south gate of Roland based on this cutscene in the original, and the line here is translated in English as, "Let's get to it and make it through this last hazing from Shara." Next is another good view of the Purcell farm, and the line here I don't even need to look up because this is one of the few English screenshots that was provided. It's again from the Crop Muncher side quest and Estelle saying, "Hey, get back here, you little furball." Next is Estelle and Joshua again talking south of Roland, this time from the scene after the Ismelis Tower incident, and the line is the one translated in English as, "Isn't being a bracer what you've always dreamed of? How can you expect to succeed if you let something like what happened today discourage you?" Then we have Shara talking, and this was seen in one of the trailers. It's the same line about how they need recommendations from all the branches, but the camera angle is obviously significantly different, and the auto-advance text is off here, so I'm going to assume if you just leave it on this line for a while, it eventually pans to this, because I liked the angle in the other shot better. Moving down a row, we've got an aerial shot of Roland, and this one unfortunately might just be dev cam and not something you can actually do in the final game. Firstly, though the minimap says there are plenty of NPCs around, we can't actually see any of them, even though a couple should at least be visible from here. Secondly, even Estelle and Joshua, I think, are invisible, as they shouldn't be quite blocked by the clock tower from the angle everything's at, but I can't be entirely for sure, and that might be the feet of the NPC on top of it there, so maybe they are just all completely hidden. Either way, we can see the Elias Highway going south out of town, and at last, we can finally see the Bright family house just to the right of the middle of the screen up on top. At first, I thought this was just the Purcell farmhouse, since that's roughly in the same direction, but this house is more directly southwest from the city, as well as also a bit closer than the Purcell farm should be, given the new distances between objects with the scaling up of locations in the remake. And also, the Bright house is 2 floors, while the Purcell house is only 1. So this does just appear to be the Bright house in the same position as it's always been, and it was just coincidence that we weren't able to see it in any other shots prior to this one. Now, depending on how much camera control we get on top of the clock tower, that's probably the only place in normal gameplay it's actually going to be visible from Roland, but the fact that everything is laid out in such a way really suggests that they did a very good job of laying out the entirety of Liberal, and again, that there are not going to be a lot of loading zones in this game. Next is just the early FC trio at the south gate of Roland again. This time, Cher is in the party lead and it's twilight. I don't really have much to say this time. After that is basically the exact same shot of the Lind in port as we've seen before, except this time it's zoomed out a little bit so we can see very tiny Estelle, Joshua, and Shara. I'm assuming this is literally the scene where it takes off after Cassius gets on. After that is what I'm again going to assume is just part of an establishing shot the first time you get here, if this is going to be in the final game at all, because we have a very nice view of the Kingfisher Inn from Valyria Lake itself. And in the background, we can even see the top bit of the Amberol Tower, which is pretty cool, I guess. The next picture is also very cool, as it is the inside of Bose Market. There's no UI and no NPC, so this is almost certainly just dev footage, but it's nice to see that other iconic locations, and not just stuff from the Roland region, is being given lots of love as well. And this looks like the Sky remakes are also going to have the very delicious looking bread that the original Sky games did, so I'm excited about that as well. Lastly, for this row is just Estelle on her own running west on the Milch Main Road again. In this case, we can see that there are a lot of these new beetle enemies present, more so than the Lily Movers, which were like the actual enemy there in the first place. And the airship up there, again, appears to be the Lind, so I'm not sure if or when we'll be allowed to actually see the Cecilia, because it has not shown up at all yet in this trailer, unless both ships are using the exact same color scheme, and I've just been getting them confused the entire time. This last row is battle focused, so I think it's going to go very quick. The first is a bit earlier from the shot of Estelle and Joshua running up to the Ismaelis Tower from the second trailer. There we can see 3 of these new beetle guys. 2 of them are back-tackable, and it doesn't look like any of them are weak to an art Estelle has, even though she has all of the offensive arts. So screw the Rhinocider, we found the real guys who have no elemental weaknesses this time. Next is Estelle running through the Malga Mine. This is a slightly different location in the dungeon from the clip in the second trailer, but other than that, not really any new information. After that, we have another screenshot directly from the trailer, this time Estelle dodging the seed spit by the Lily Mover, and after that, it's just a snapshot of her hitting it and initiating a battle. Once again, this is not enough information for me to definitively say if overworld combat is going to be full mini-action game like the Daybreak games, or just more advanced hitting enemies on the field to initiate a battle, like in later Cold Steel and Reverie. After that is a screenshot from the Rhinocider clip showing off a few arts. This one was also translated, and not only is the Rhinocider still called the Rhinocider, but all of the arts maintain their names that they had in the original Sky FC, which makes sense because literally everything except the EX and Firebolt EX in the arts names is just in English written in katakana, so it would be really weird if they didn't screw that up. Or, sorry, rather, this is before the Beauty's Blade era of the series, so it would be weird for them to have screwed something this obvious up back then. It happens all the time nowadays, but hey, reusing the Xseed script for the Sky games means we don't have to worry about that this time. The last screenshot is just the Rhinocider getting set on fire. Probably shouldn't have saved this set for last, but hey, it happens sometimes. I am very rapidly running out of things to say. If this is your first Luxon video, I do this a lot whenever there's a trailer for something I'm passionate about, so if there are more big trailers for this game and this video does well, there will be more things like this. Stay tuned for that. Maybe I'll make other more Trails content. It depends on how well this one's received, as always, because me Xeno channel, when me make not Xeno video, people no watch. People no watch when me make Xenogears or Xenosaga video even, so I can barely do that. I can barely make Xenoblade X videos if I want to be relevant in the algorithm anymore, but this is not the video to be ranting about people not caring about other good Xeno games that will hopefully get re-released at some point. That's not going to happen. We got Trails in the Sky being remade completely before we got a Xenogears port to anything that came out after 2011. I think I've lost the plot here. Thank you for watching if you've made it far enough to be hearing me right now. Stay tuned for my next video, which is probably going to be Xeno related, but hey, if you like Trail stuff, there's probably going to be more Trail stuff on this channel eventually. I would love to do something about Kai, more or less as soon as the PC version comes out, so I can play it in as compromised a translation as I need to get through it and talk about it, because apparently there's stuff worth talking about in there. Anyway, until whenever the next video you see of me, or even if you never hear of me again for the rest of your life, I suppose, though that would be a little depressing on multiple levels. This is Luxon, signing off.